On deck of an escort destroyer somewhere in the Atlantic, the sea spray clung to the rails and the men's breaths came in ragged puffs against the early morning cold. The engines of the U-boat hunting group hummed low. Each destroyer's hull cut through wave after wave, sent spray that tasted of sea and steel. Deep inside the belly of the ship, the sonar operator sat alone in his cramped compartment, headphones clamped over ears, eyes fixed on a flickering trace. He listened for that faint ping, echo, ping, that minute distortion in the water that betrayed hidden danger. For most of the war, his kind had been chasing ghosts. The deep tried to swallow signals, bubbles confused readings. U-boats dove beneath thermoclines and vanished. But now something was changing. Across the ocean in a lab, scientists had spent months, years wrestling with echo ranging, the curves of sound waves, the mysterious thermoclines below, the way a submarine could slip into silence and melt into the depths. They had developed, refined, and bundled their ideas into the device tucked into the hull of that destroyer. Known to the Brits as ASDIC, to the Americans as Sonar, it would send out a pulse, wait for the echo, and return a bearing and distance. But this time it wasn't just the machine, it was the men who had learned to listen. Trained in bunkers, simulators, filtered recordings of submarine propellers, so that when a contact mumbled in the headphones, they could swear they heard a heartbeat in the dark. In the eerie hush beneath the waves, the U-boat skulked. Its diesel engines had gone silent, its electric motors whispered, and it drifted with the current, heart pounding with danger. Above the surface, the escort ships roamed like wolves in winter, waiting for the sound that would betray the hunter. The moment the operator heard a return signal and shouted, "Contact bearing 130, range 1,200 yards." The bridge tensed, men snapped to action. A depth charge rack swung open and the destroyer lunged forward. Moments later, the sea roiled violently. A geyser of oil and water marked the kill, and another gray hull slipped beneath the waves. It was invisible war, each kill a whisper, each death unseen. By early 1943, the tide of the campaign had turned. The U-boats, which only a year before had ruthlessly stalked convoys with impunity, now found themselves under relentless pressure. On convoys like Convoy ONS-5, when a swarm of more than 30 U-boats attacked 40-odd merchant ships, the escorts inflicted heavy losses on the attackers. It was a moment when the predator learned that the forest itself had sharpened its claws. In that month known as Black May, May 1943, the German U-boat arm lost 43 boats, about a quarter of its strength. On one night in that month, a U-boat captain surfaced his periscope, breathing stale diesel fumes, looking for prey. The wind roared around the conning tower, rain hit the deck, and the sea glimmered with phosphorescent froth, and yet he felt uneasy, because somewhere below the surface, a destroyer's sonar had locked on him. The contact had been made not by sight or radio, but by a pulse of sound bouncing off his hull, a ping that carried through the water straight into the ears of a trained operator. And then the depth charges dropped, not blindly but precisely, guided by the new mindset that turned audio into action. Then the captain felt the explosion, the steel groan of hull plating, the smell of burning cable, and the sea erupted as he tried to flee beneath the layers of cold water. He never heard the last ping. On the destroyer's bridge, the chief sonar operator measured his pulse against the echo indicator, his heart thundering as the mount swung forward. The charge was armed. The sea shook. Oil slick, debris, a few men bobbing in survival suits. Then silence. The U-boat had gone. With each sinking, morale on the escort crews rose. Yet with each success came a weight of horror, because those gray hulls belonged to men much like themselves. The hunters reminded themselves, this is war. We hunt only because they sought to starve nations, and yet the fear never left. The next ping might be false, might be thermocline, might be trick. The margin remained razor thin. What made the difference wasn't just the machine, it was the people who believed the machine could be more than noise. In the labs at National Defense Research Committee, scientists wrestled with underwater acoustics, how sound traveled differently when water changed temperature, how an echo might bend, bounce, fade. They devised gyro-controlled sonar arrays, reverberation gain controls, training devices that taught men to hear the difference between a submarine's propeller and a school of fish. On board an escort ship, the sonar dome slumped quietly under the waves, unseen, a silent eye into the depths. The sonar operator frowned, hearing a faint rhythmic tick, 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 too regular for marine life. He called it in. The escort commander ordered two ships to form a creeping attack. One maintained contact, pinging slowly, while the other moved in at low speed, guided by signals from the first. Suddenly, the sea erupted. A U-boat had been found, tracked, hit. This was new. Old depth-charge tactics often missed. Now the kill rate rose because technology and method merged. In the submarine's cramped control room, the crew huddled in their oil-smudged coveralls, listening to their own pumps, feeling the cold sweat run down the side of the pressure hull. They knew the sonar was out there. They felt his presence in every thumping pulse beneath them. They knew that once a ping bounced and the escorts had a bearing, the hunt began. Some tried to dive beneath thermoclines, trot the evasive maneuvers, discharge bubbles, trick echoes, but the operators were trained to expect that. The war had shifted. The invisible had become lethal. As the month of May wore on, escort groups began working as if choreographed. Operators heard echoes, plotted tracks, and entire convoys were rerouted. The U-boat arm, once confident of dominance, now found itself shrinking back. In the Bay of Biscay to the French Atlantic coast, aircraft with long-range radar blanketed the sea, making transit perilous. Over the Atlantic, sonar-trained escorts closed the net. On 24th May, the German commander, Karl Dönitz, ordered stop operations in the North Atlantic, a tacit admission that the hunt had become a slaughter. Meanwhile, on the bridge of a small corvette, the signals officer gazed around at the gray seas, the rain, the low cloud hanging like a lid over the convoy. He listened for static, for bearings, for the faint thrum of engine noise beneath the waves. He felt a chill, not only of fear, but of responsibility. This convoy carried food, fuel, the lifeline for Britain and beyond. They had to hold. At dawn, he reported a contact, bearing 70, range 1,500 yards. The escort that hunted found the U-boat, depth-charged it until its hull cracked and the sea claimed it. The count 30 sailors gone in a burst of steel, flame, and foam. The corvette crew watched the survivors bob in life jackets and wondered how many had known the sound of the ping before their boat went down. They felt a mix of relief, sorrow, exhaustion. In the diesel fumes of the submarine base at Lorient, U-boat crews returned with broken boats or not at all. The numbers told the story. 43 boats lost in 1 month. U-boat crews sent up telegrams, messages of the missing, of the men never coming home. The hunters had become hunted. The ocean changed, no longer a silent predator's lair, but a battlefield lit by invisible waves. The human cost was immense. The U-boat service suffered one of the highest death rates of any arm. Yet in the destroyer mess, after the victory phone call came in, the men did not cheer. They lit cigarettes in the rain, stared at the sea, felt the weight of what they had done and what remained to be done. In the months that followed, the supply convoys of the Allies sailed with greater courage, knowing the sonar screens were now their shield. The U-boats never regained their once terrifying dominance in the Atlantic. May 1943 stands as the turning point, the moment when the ocean tilted. In laboratories and yards, the work continued, sonar refined, aircraft ranged farther, tactics sharpened. The invisible technology had done its job, but it was the human minds and nerves that made the difference. On one of the escort ships, the sonar operator, who'd still carry the faint echo of that first contact in his mind, retired many years later, silent but proud. He remembered the dread of night watches, the seasickness in winter storms, the moment when his pulse aligned with a ping and the depth charges rattled. He remembered the pink dawn light over the Atlantic when the sea was still, and the sense that something had changed forever. He never spoke of heroism, only that he did his job while others died doing theirs. Across the Atlantic in Britain, engineers looked at the sonar domes, the radio intercepts, the map of U-boat losses, and understood that technology alone wins no war. People make it win. They recalled the scientists in their labs, the students in their classes, the training of operators who learned to hear submarines the way a dog hears thunder. Innovation had signed its contract in blood and waves. In Germany, the U-boat veterans returned to peacetime haunted by what they had lost: boats, comrades, futures. They could not undo the silence that followed the pings. They could only know that the tide had turned against them. The waves keep rolling. The sea remains vast and indifferent. But for 1 month in the Atlantic, the invisible became decisive, and through courage, training, human will, and a pulse of sound beneath the waves, men changed the course of history. The lesson echoes that even when the enemy hides in shadow, even when the weapon cannot be seen, ordinary people, laboratory engineers, sonar operators, destroyer crews, can pull back the curtain. They remind us that courage and creativity are not the realm of giants alone, but of those who listen when the world falls silent, who ping the deep and respond to the... By early 1943, the Atlantic had become a graveyard of steel. The sea that once hid the German wolf packs now betrayed them with whispers of sound. For years, U-boats had ruled these waters with ruthless precision, surfacing under the cover of night, torpedoing helpless convoys, and slipping back into the blackness before dawn. The Allies called it the happy time for the Germans. Merchant sailors called it something else: the terror below. But this reign of silence was about to end, not through brute force, but through the quiet rhythm of innovation. The hunters were about to become the hunted. It began with Convoy ONS-5, a slow-moving fleet of merchant ships bound for Halifax, crawling through a stormy Atlantic night in May 1943. The air stank of diesel and fear. Waves slammed against the hulls, and every shadow on the radar screen looked like death. Above the howl of the wind, the destroyer's sonar pulses clicked rhythmically through the black water. Ping, 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 like the heartbeat of something alive. Then on one destroyer, a young operator stiffened. A faint echo returned, unnatural, deliberate. He froze, then called out, "Contact bearing 130, range 1,200 yards." Instantly, the bridge came alive. Boots pounded on steel. Orders snapped through the cold air. Engines roared, and the destroyer veered toward the contact. Somewhere below, the U-boat's commander, a man named Heinrich Müller, heard the faint thump of the sonar pulse through the hull. He knew that sound. It was death knocking. Müller barked orders. "Crash dive!" His crew scrambled, sealing hatches, diving deeper into the coal black. The submarine plunged beneath the thermocline into a layer of water that bent sound and masked their position. For a moment, silence. They thought they had escaped. The Allies had learned the sea's secrets. New sonar systems could distinguish the subtle shift of a thermocline, tracking a submarine even when it tried to vanish. The destroyer slowed, creeping forward with precision. Depth charges rolled off the stern, each one sinking with a hollow splash. A few seconds later, the ocean erupted. The first explosion rocked the submarine like an earthquake. Lights flickered, gauges burst, and men screamed as they were thrown against the walls. The hull groaned under pressure. Müller gripped the periscope base, his knuckles white. "Hold her steady," he shouted, though his own voice shook. Above, the destroyer's crew listened. They could hear it, the metallic shriek of the submarine twisting in agony. Another echo, another charge, another explosion. Then came the sound every sonar operator dreaded but respected. A low rumbling sigh, followed by a rush of bubbles rising fast to the surface. Oil slick. Debris. Silence. Contact lost. The destroyer's captain removed his cap, his face pale. He said nothing. There was no cheering, just the sound of the sea closing over the wreck. That night, 3 more U-boats tried to attack the convoy. 3 more never came home. By dawn, the Atlantic had changed forever. In Germany, Admiral Karl Donitz read the reports in disbelief. The numbers were impossible. In 1 week, more U-boats had been lost than in the previous 2 months combined. Something invisible was hunting them, something that owes through the ocean itself. Donitz ordered his captains to regroup, to adapt. But deep down, he knew the truth. The U-boat arm was bleeding out. "The sea," he once wrote, "which had been our ally, has turned against us." For the men on both sides, the transformation was almost spiritual. Allied sailors who had once cowered in convoys now sailed with grim confidence, knowing that their invisible guardians, those who listened in dark rooms filled with the hum of machinery, were watching over them. Yet that confidence came at a price. The sonar operators, sitting alone with their headphones pressed tight, began to feel the war differently. Each ping that found an enemy also meant 100 men trapped in steel coffins, dying far below. Some operators later confessed that when they closed their eyes at night, they could still hear the echo returning through the water, like ghosts tapping from the deep. Because in that month, May 1943, later called Black May, the tide of the Atlantic War turned. 43 U-boats went down, dragged into the depths by a technology the enemy could neither see nor stop. The wolf packs were broken, the convoys sailed safer, and for the first time in years, the Atlantic felt survivable. But behind every victory was the hum of a sonar pulse and the steady hand of a man who dared to listen to the darkness and answer it with courage. The secret weapon that changed everything was not forged in steel or fire. It was born in silence. While battles raged across the Atlantic, another war was being fought in laboratories, classrooms, and training huts hidden far from the front lines. Here, men and women wrestled not with bullets, but with equations, circuits, and the mysteries of sound. They were scientists, engineers, teachers, ordinary people with extraordinary patience. They called their creation ASD-IC in Britain, SONR in America. To the untrained ear, it was just a pulse of sound, a meaningless ping. But in that ping lay the power to see the unseen, to turn the invisible into something human eyes could hunt. In the dim light of a Royal Navy workshop, an engineer named Robert Boyle adjusted a small transmitter no larger than a kettle drum. It hummed softly as it sent vibrations into a tank of seawater. Around him, the air smelled of solder and salt. Boyle was no warrior. He had never fired a gun in anger, but he believed sound could win a war. He knew that water, unlike air, carried vibrations faster, stronger, farther. If they could master how sound waves bounced off a submarine's curved hull, they could detect an enemy long before it struck. Yet what seemed simple on paper was a nightmare in practice. The ocean was full of noise, currents, whales, the churn of propellers. To hear a submarine, you had to first learn to hear everything else. So they trained men to listen, not just technically, but intuitively, to feel the difference between life and metal. In small, airless rooms in the Western Approach's tactical unit, recruits sat for hours with headphones on, their eyes closed, learning to distinguish a U-boat's propeller beat from that of a fishing trawler. The recordings were faint, distorted, maddening. Some couldn't bear it, the constant whine and hum like ghosts whispering through static. Others adapted, their minds reshaping themselves to the rhythms of the sea. They began to hear meaning in the chaos. They became the world's first sound detectives. By 1943, their mastery had reached the front lines. The sonar transducer, mounted under the ship's hull, sent out timed pulses that struck objects and returned as echoes. Operators could calculate range and bearing from the delay. But the real breakthrough came when sonar was paired with Hedgehog, a new forward-throwing weapon that allowed ships to attack while keeping contact. Before, a destroyer had to sail over the spot and drop depth charges, losing sonar contact at the crucial moment. Now it could aim and fire without breaking the link. The hunters could see and strike in the same breath. Down in the black depths, U-boat captains began to sense something uncanny. Even when they dove below the thermocline, even when they shut down engines and drifted silently, the enemy seemed to know. They could feel the faint vibrations brushing their hulls like fingertips. Some crews started hearing the sonar pings in their sleep long after the battle was over. To them, it felt supernatural, an invisible eye watching from above. But it wasn't magic. It was mathematics, patience, and the human ear are trained to perfection. Aboard one Allied destroyer, an operator named John Cook sat hunched over his screen, sweat dripping down his temple despite the cold. He was 19. The headphones pressed tight to his skull. Each pulse he sent into the water came back twisted, muffled, distorted by the restless Atlantic. He adjusted the dial, heart racing. Then, an echo, faint but steady. He knew that sound, not fish, not driftwood, a submarine creeping beneath the convoy. He relayed the bearing. The captain ordered a hedgehog salvo. Seconds later, the sea erupted. The echo vanished. Cook leaned back, shaking, unsure whether to feel victory or horror. He had just ended dozens of lives he would never see. In that moment, the war had changed forever. The balance of terror shifted from the surface to the depths. The invisible had become visible, not through sight but through sound. And with each passing week, the sonar grew sharper, faster, more precise. Operators began to joke grimly that they no longer needed to hunt U-boats, only to listen for them. But behind that dark humor lay fatigue and fear. Listening was exhausting work. One wrong judgment, one mistaken echo, and the convoy could be lost. They bore the weight of 1,000 lives every time they turned a dial. Still they listened, night after night, through storms and static, through fatigue and fear, because every ping was a promise that somewhere out there a ship would make it home, a crew would see another sunrise, a mother would not receive a telegram. It was invisible work, uncelebrated, unseen, but it was the quiet heartbeat of victory. The Germans never found a true countermeasure. They tried decoys, noisemakers, deep dives, even coating hulls with rubber to absorb sound. But the Allies kept adapting. Each innovation met a new response, each deception unraveled by sharper minds. The war beneath the waves had become a chess match fought with echoes and courage. And so, by mid-1943, sonar was no longer just a tool. It was a language, a way for men to speak to the sea, to ask it where danger lay, and to hear its answer. The invisible had found its voice, and that voice spoke in pings and pulses that would decide the fate of nations. By the spring of 1943, the Atlantic was no longer silent. It throbbed with sound, pulses, echoes, engines, depth charges. For years, the ocean had belonged to the predators below, but now it sang with the heartbeat of the hunters above. Convoy after convoy crossed those gray waters under a new kind of protection. Not faith, not luck, but a wall of sound so powerful it could find an enemy in total darkness. Yet beneath the triumph, there was always a cost. Every echo found meant a struggle between life and death. Every kill was followed by silence, and silence at sea could mean anything. May 1943, Black May. The month the sea changed sides. In just 30 days, 43 German U-boats were destroyed, the greatest loss the submarine arm had ever suffered. The numbers staggered even the victors. It wasn't a single weapon that did it, nor a miracle stroke of fortune, but a symphony of human effort. The sonar operators, the radar crews, the code breakers at Bletchley Park, the engineers who had built the Hedgehog and refined sonar until it could pierce the sea itself. Together they turned the invisible into victory. But the battle was never clean. In the cramped control room of a U-boat somewhere south of Greenland, the air was foul and heavy with diesel fumes. The captain, Hans Kruger, watched his men with a grim calm. He had been at sea since 1940, through the glory days when convoys scattered before them like frightened birds. Now he saw only ghosts. He knew the Allies could find them faster than they could strike. The pinging started, faint, rhythmic, merciless. The men froze. They knew that sound now as well as their own breathing. Kruger whispered to his helmsman, silent running. The engine stopped. The U-boat drifted through darkness. The only sound was the creak of metal in the distant heartbeat of sonar above. Minutes passed. Then, an explosion. The boat lurched violently, instruments shattered, lights flickered out. Panic, shouting. Another explosion tore through the hull. Water rushed in, ice cold and unstoppable. The captain clung to the periscope housing, knowing it was over. Surface, someone cried. He shook his head. To surface meant death by gunfire. To stay meant drowning. He chose neither. He simply whispered, "Forgive me." Moments later, the sea swallowed them whole. Above, on the destroyer's deck, men watched oil bloom across the waves like black petals. The captain removed his cap. No one cheered. Every victory exacted a toll. The Allies celebrated fewer attacks, fewer convoys lost. But for every U-boat destroyed, there were men trapped in their steel coffins, dying namelessly in the cold dark. And those who hunted them carried that weight. Sonar operators began to dream of echoes, phantom contacts, false alarms, ghost sounds of submarines that no longer existed. Some swore they could still hear the pings long after the headphones were off. They called it the hum, the echo of the deep that never really stopped. Yet even with the toll, there was no turning back. The new Allied escort groups, built around aircraft carriers and sonar-equipped destroyers, worked with brutal efficiency. They hunted not by sight but by sound and logic, pinpointing U-boats, coordinating attacks, cutting off escape routes. Each mission was a test of nerve and endurance. Many operators were barely 20 years old, but they bore responsibilities older than any war hero of legend. When the convoy survived, they would stand on deck at sunrise watching the endless expanse of water stretch to the horizon, knowing that beneath those waves lay the wrecks of their enemies and the ghosts of men who might have been them. At bases along the French coast, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, Brest, the mood in the U-boat pens turned from pride to despair. Commanders watched their numbers vanish from the boards. 43 boats gone in 1 month, hundreds of men missing, their fate sealed by an enemy that fought without ever showing its face. Admiral Donitz, once confident that his U-boats could starve Britain into submission, now stared at the charts in disbelief. He ordered a halt to operations in the North Atlantic, a tacit admission that the ocean had turned against them. For the first time, the Wolfpack had no hunt left. In London, the news reached the Admiralty in silence. There were no parades, no toasts. The war still raged elsewhere, and everyone knew the Atlantic could turn cruel again. But in that moment, something had shifted irreversibly. The sea, once ruled by fear, had become a shield. Men who once prayed they'd see another dawn now began to believe they might. Convoys that once vanished into the fog now arrived, damaged, but alive. Food reached Britain, fuel reached the factories, the lifeline held. And in the quiet rooms where sonar operators trained, a few of them sat with hands trembling after long shifts. They had done what few could comprehend, waged war through sound, balancing between science and instinct. They had not seen their enemies, yet they had ended them. When asked later how it felt, one operator simply said, "You never forget the first echo that didn't come back." The Atlantic had been tamed by invisible hands, by sound waves and courage, by intellect and sacrifice. But victory had a cost measured not in ships, but in souls. And as the war moved on to new theaters, the men who fought it carried the deep with them forever. The knowledge that beneath every calm sea lies a graveyard of echoes, and that silence, once their enemy, had become their greatest weapon.